Hey guys,
Welcome to our talk, Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales beginning a new adventure.
so we're Shane and Ben. Shane is a designer.
Ben here is a writer. We've been at Insomniac now for about 4 years. We worked pretty close together on Marvel Spider-Man and then really close together on Miles. And for those that are curious, this is our buddy Adele, also an Insomniac, also a cool dude.
Okay, so what are we here to talk about? Winter break. So, not the school holiday. Winter break was actually the code name for the very first mission of Marvel Spider Man Miles Morales. So, for those of you who haven't played the game, it's this big bombastic opening. Miles and his mentor, Peter Parker, must protect the city from a rampaging supervillain, Rhino. This mission needed to be explosive, exciting, and exhilarating, but above all else, it needed to pass the baton.
But let's back up for a second. Some of you might be asking yourselves, what is Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales, right? So Miles is the follow-up to the PlayStation 4 game from 2018, Marvel's Spider-Man. So this game was all about the heroics of one Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man. In it, we also introduced players to our version of the iconic Marvel Comics character, Miles Morales, aka also Spider-Man, right? In this game, it is all about Miles. He isn't a sidekick or a side character. He is the hero. This game, Miles Morales, is all about him, right?
Okay, and so that's why we say with this very first mission, Winter Break, we had to pass the baton. We had a brand new hero that we needed players to fall in love with without diminishing the existing hero that they already adored, Peter. And we also had a bunch of new game mechanics we needed to teach players while also refreshing them on everything from the first game. And we had to do all of that within the first 30 minutes of the game.
And some of you might be asking, how do we do in this baton passing? Well, pretty good, if we do say so ourselves. We received acclaim from critics and fans alike. We got a 9 from Game Informer and a place on Polygon's Essentials list, just to name a few. And most importantly to us, Winter Break, the first mission, was called up frequently for praise.
But it wasn't always like this. Winter Break had a pretty rocky development period. Through a lot of production, it was good, but it wasn't great. Players liked it, but it wasn't kicking off the game in a way that made them as excited as possible about our new hero and new world. And not too long before the release of the game, if you had played this mission, you would have seen something very different than what we wound up shipping. It wasn't awful, but it also wasn't living up to Miles or players' expectations of him and his game.
Okay, and as most of you devs in the crowd know, that opening missions are pretty tough. The first 30 minutes of the game often determine whether or not players are going to stick around to see the next 5, 10, or 50 hours. So on the one hand, an opening mission needs to set the stage for the world and characters. Why do players care about the story you're telling? And on the other hand, it also needs to teach the players how to just play the game, right? And how are they going to make their way through the story? So there are so many things that are at stake here in the opener from a narrative and design standpoint. It's really easy to get lost in the weeds with things.
Okay, so how do you go from this, an early version of a chase with the super villain Rhino, where if you look super close, you can almost see Rhino leap through a building in the distance, totally fine, good, but not great,
to this, right? An intimate, on-the-stick spectacle moment that puts players right in the heart of the action and really makes them feel like a superhero.
Well, that's what we're here to talk about. And spoiler, we found that 3 things were key to our success: iteration, collaboration, and focus. And to demonstrate the importance of each of these, we're going to look at a few high-level problem spaces from this first mission, outline the issues that we encountered, and then how we solved them. We're going to start with
the narrative challenges that Ben had.
Then we're going to take a look at the pacing challenges that Shane had.
And then finally, we're going to end with the finale challenges that we both had together.
So in this talk, we're going to show you what our initial ideas were, talk about why they misfired, and then we're going to talk about the solutions. Okay, let's take a look at some spider webs getting made.
Okay, but to back up a bit and get us on the same page for those who haven't played the game, let's do a quick overview of the mission that we're here to talk about, Winter Break. So this mission starts with Miles in civilian clothes, walking through the streets of his new home, Harlem, right? He's just moved to town and he's still getting to know the neighborhood. And then he gets a call from Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man, to meet up and guard a prison transport. Miles has been training with Pete since the events of the last game, and today is one of his first real assignments with his mentor, and he's super pumped on it. But things go wrong, as they do. The supervillain Rhino escapes the prison transport in dramatic fashion. Pete battles Rhino while Miles handles the escaped prisoners until Rhino then busts out and starts tearing through the city. Miles and Pete both give chase. Rhino even then busts through a populated indoor shopping mall before finally smashing into a power plant, causing a massive blackout throughout the entire city of Manhattan. And then this is when we bring the tempo down and things get really serious, right? So Pete, exhausted from the chase and battling Rhino, is almost nearly killed by Rhino. But then Miles discovers a latent power that he never knew he had inside of him, his explosive new venom abilities. Using this power, he subdues Rhino and ends up saving his mentor, Peter Parker. So Pete, grateful, gives Miles an early Christmas gift and announces that he's going to be leaving town for a week on vacation. But he's very confident that the city is in good hands after today's events and dubs Miles his new protege, New York's only Spider-Man, thus setting the stage for Miles on his first big solo adventure and the whole game to come. So, all right, that's the mission we shipped with. Let's get into the problems that we encountered along the way here.
Cool. Okay, so first up, like we said, we're going to talk about some of the narrative problems that I encountered, although really it was Shane and I and a ton of other collaborators who were dealing with these issues. So chief among these problems were issues with Miles's initial characterization. So emotionally, the heart of our game was the relationship between Miles and the residents of a neighborhood he has just recently moved to, Harlem. We often referred to this as a love story. Miles and Harlem would start at odds, gradually discover things that they loved in each other. And by the end of the game, they'd be thick as thieves. And so even during very early testing, players really liked this arc. They loved seeing Miles and his new home, Harlem, fall for each other. But generally speaking, they did not like where it started. We always knew that the game was going to open with Miles in civilian clothes, walking through his new home, Harlem. And so in our first execution of this opening mission, we thought, okay, what's the opposite of love? Well, hate, obviously. So this is a clip from a very early previs of the game's opening cinematic. This would have been the very first thing that players would have seen when they booted the game up. And if you watch the whole version of this early cinematic, you can see Miles and Harlem very much at odds. Miles gets in people's way. He nearly gets hit by a car. He's sneered at by the locals. And he talks a lot about how much cooler his old home, Brooklyn, is than Harlem. And this trend continued throughout the first act of the game, even hitting a peak teenage moment with Miles telling his mom that Harlem was her home, not his. Okay, so all of this certainly set up the idea that Miles and Harlem didn't like each other, but it left us with a pretty big problem. Miles, while maybe being an authentic teenager, wasn't very heroic, and worse, his neighbors in Harlem all kind of seemed like jerks. So why should players bother fighting for Harlem if Harlem was being mean to them all the time? And if Miles didn't like Harlem, why should we? So if the goal of an opener is to hook players from the word go, we were failing. Okay, so how do we fix this? Well, it wasn't by throwing everything out. It was by iterating and adjusting by degrees. Instead of starting Miles and Harlem in a place where they actively disliked each other, we started them as strangers who just don't know each other yet. Miles is a good guy, his neighbors are good people, and our game was an opportunity for the two of them to meet. We told ourselves that instead of players asking, why would Miles and Harlem ever love each other? We wanted them to say, why wouldn't they ever love each other? To this end, we made some small creative choices throughout the opening cinematic of the game to help endear players to both Miles and Harlem. So this is a clip from the shipped version of our opening cinematic. In it, you can see Miles letting people off the subway first. He helps a guy move his furniture, and he genuinely praises a street artist that he encounters. And for Harlem's part, all of Miles's neighbors respond with enthusiastic gratitude. Miles is a stranger, but they're ready to welcome him. We like Miles and we like Harlem. So it's clear that Miles doesn't know the neighborhood and they don't know him, but they want to get to know each other. And that's the thing that gives our story drive. So suddenly, with these small changes, we found players were endeared to Miles and his neighborhood right away. They liked our opening, not just our ending. Okay, but then what was the second big narrative problem? Way too much exposition. We were the sequel to an enormous game picking up a story and media res. And we thought that we had to explain who Miles is, who his family and friends are, what a Roxxon is, why Rhino's hanging from a helicopter, and oh yeah, is Pete leaving town? Where is he going? What's up with that? We felt like we needed to answer every possible question players could have in the first 30 minutes of the game, but it soon became just a little bit too much. Even worse, even though we were telling players a ton of information, they weren't retaining any of it. It was like they were trying to cram for a midterm the night before the test. We were just dumping way too much information on them way too fast. So here's just one small example of how overloaded we were. This is a clip from the very beginning of the game, our first moments of pure gameplay, and this was going to be the first line of gameplay dialogue that players heard.
There's the raft. Can't believe it's finally repaired. And now I'm gonna help escort prisoners back to it. Life is weird.
Okay, yeah, that's right. So Miles's first line of gameplay dialogue in our eagerly awaited Spider-Man game was exposition about a prison. So far from explaining anything about the distant floating prison and what it had to do with Miles, this line just confused players even more. But I gotta be honest with you, at the time when I wrote this line, I really thought that we needed to explain this to players. But okay, how did we solve this problem of too much exposition? Spring cleaning. This meant slimming down details and as much as possible, letting players discover those details at the same time as Miles. So for example, instead of starting the game with the assumption that Pete is leaving on vacation, which was something that Miles originally knew, but the player did not, we rewrote things so that Pete's leaving on vacation was a surprise to Miles, just like it was to players. And instead of trying to cram a lot of awkward exposition about Roxxon, our villainous faction, into the first mission, we built another mission later on where Miles and the player investigate the tech giant and slowly discover what they're all about. So through this process of refining the first mission, we asked players really need to know. And it turns out they don't need to know all that much. Okay, so remember that clip of Miles talking about a floating prison, the raft? This is what we wound up replacing it with. So our mission was the start of an amazing new adventure for an amazing new hero. The important thing wasn't exposition, it was emotion. It was making sure that Miles's enthusiasm matched the players. That was the most important thing. Exposition could come later. But okay, that's enough about narrative challenges for now. Let's take a look at some of the gameplay challenges.
Okay, so this mission essentially was one big encounter with the well-known Marvel villain, Rhino, right? We were going to fight him a little bit in the streets when he first escapes, then chase him across the city, and then finally take him out at the power plant. And early on, we had this really cool idea of let's have Rhino smash through an indoor shopping mall. And like even better, let's have Miles attached to Rhino and ride him like a bucking bronco when he does it. So we all got really excited about it and dubbed the sequence the Rhino Rodeo. And it quickly received a lot of attention from the team as we began to build this mission out. But the problem ended up being, while everyone was focused on Rhino Rodeo in the mall, the core chase outside in the city really fell by the wayside. So that meant that while the mall got cooler and cooler, everything else was sort of just falling flat. In the chase, Rhino was kind of just like running down empty city streets, clipping a building or two, not really too much going on. So we kind of thought like, hey, like rodeo's cool in the mall. Why don't we just kind of do that everywhere, right? So here's a clip from that initial version of the chase. Those of you that are familiar with the chase here might notice that we're starting it a bit further back than we did in the original shipped game. The overall chase was longer then, and we kind of just drop you into a swing, nothing too special or memorable. We had some cool ideas like zipping through this smashed building, but because it was core gameplay and players could do it dynamically, most players just sort of swung around the building and never saw it. And then the big thing in this clip, as you'll see here, is Rhino Rodeo out in the streets of Manhattan. It's pretty cool, right? Like players could zip on a Rhino dynamically, ride him for a bit before he then bucked you off and return a swing. But the problem ended up being, instead of making the whole mission better, this actually just made things worse. Miles riding Rhino was overstaying its welcome, and by showing it here, we were spoiling the mall, which was up next later on. The mall was always intended to be a pacing spike in between the two core traversal beats, but because it wasn't fresh, it felt like more of the same. So it was absolutely the wrong call to make there. So how do we fix this? Well, first, we decided to pull Rhino Rodeo from the open streets and keep it and save it for the mall, keep that as a special moment. And then second, we realized that we needed to shorten the overall chase path and drop you right into the cool part. So that optional building zip through, we made it mandatory now right at the start of the chase. It was a high action moment that players were guaranteed to see. And then we shortened the overall chase path and we focused on deploying dynamic events that players would see just about every swing, right? So by reducing the overall ground we needed to cover and making sure that we kept players' attention along the way, suddenly the mall wasn't really the only cool part of the chase anymore. So here's the ship version. You'll notice that compared with the earlier version, we start you off on a much higher note and maintain that momentum throughout. And then just when interest in chasing rhino starts to wane, we surprise the player with the awesome moment of Rhino Rodeo in the mall. So through iteration, we were really able to refine the chase and find the fun. We also had to have a few conversations as a team about ideas that sort of felt strong on paper, like riding rhino through the city streets, but ended up overall undermining the experience as a whole. So we realized that if the entire mission was pinned up at an 11, there wasn't any room for contrast or memorability, right? Oops, back one more. Okay, so we've talked a bit about the shopping mall sequence. Now let's actually dig into it a bit. The shopping mall's initial purpose, as we've been saying, was always supposed to serve as an entry spike in between the two legs of the chase. You've sort of swung behind Rhino for a while, you've gotten used to it. Now we need to rehook you with something that you've never done before we ask you to then swing again. Doesn't need to be long or fancy, just something to put the interest spike back into the overall curve of the mission. But like we said before, this sequence got the team very excited. So we were pumped about this Rhino Rodeo mechanic, and we kind of went in with the mentality of, let's get our money's worth, right? And use this mechanic as much as possible. But the end result ended up being, we ended up producing a sequence that was about 2 times longer than it needed to be. And instead of rehooking the player for the next leg of the chase, we ended up wearing them out and undercutting the overall enthusiasm. So here's a clip of that initial version of the mall here. This stretch, riding Rhino past a series of shops, was what I always envisioned as the big showpiece for this mechanic. It was a nice long stretch where players would really get a feel for what it was like to steer a supervillain, narrowly avoiding disaster. But the problem was, the moment players got the feel for what it was like to steer Rhino, the sequence really had nowhere to go. And the mechanics started to feel thin. You were just sort of riding down a corridor, smashing pillars, not really too much going on. And again, the mall was supposed to just be an interest spike, but we ended up ballooning it into something that much larger than we intended it to be. So the fix for this ended up being, we needed an interest spike inside of our interest spike, right? So what was that interest spike we ended up shipping with? Well, this game here is about heroes, so we needed to save someone. In this case, a helpless baby stuck in the path of Rhino's destruction. This was a moment where collaboration truly came in and saved the day. James Ham, one of our amazing animators, produced this QuickTime event almost overnight. And once this QTE got hooked up in game, the whole mall sequence really came together and just started to click, right? So here's the version we shipped with, a highly memorable moment that puts the hook back in the player's mouth. Adding the baby save meant that players spent less time controlling Rhino directly and never really got a feel for it, but that was exactly the point. This sequence was supposed to be about barely avoiding disaster by the skin of your teeth, narrowly managing to avoid a totally out of control supervillain, and thank God, avoiding any casualties. It left players feeling like Miles, victorious, but not quite sure if it was because of skill or luck. Okay, so those are our big gameplay challenges. Now let's move on to a shared challenge that we both had, which was the end of the mission.
Okay, so endings are important, right? You might say that they're the most important thing. So as a refresher, at the end of this mission, Peter Parker is nearly killed by Rhino, and Miles is forced to step in and save the day. It's a big, dramatic grasp of victory, narrowly from the jaws of defeat. Or at least that was our initial intent, right? The problem, I kind of messed up the tone. Instead of playing it straight, I played it for laughs. Not all the way through, but enough that it was hard for everybody, players included, to take the whole thing seriously. So in this clip, you'll see an early version of the lead up to the end of the mission. Rhino is seconds away from demolishing a power plant and nearly killing Peter Parker in the process.
Hey, how's it going? You know, saving the city, as you do.
Save the city? I think not.
Oh, bad, very bad.
So Pete's about to be in mortal peril, but if you're watching this clip, you wouldn't really know how serious it is from the way that Pete and Miles are acting. They're just doing their jokey hero banter thing. And this was true throughout the mission. Miles and Pete joked almost constantly, even when Pete was nearly dying. And I'll be honest, sometimes the jokes were pretty decent. But even though this was very on brand for Spider-Man, a character known for his wisecracks, if Miles and Pete didn't take the situation seriously, the player was never going to take it seriously either. And even worse, we wanted to build to a moment where Miles dramatically rescues Pete, but nobody was ever going to take that moment seriously if Pete himself wasn't taking it seriously. So this wasn't something that players could directly articulate, but we did see in user testing that nobody felt like Pete was actually in danger at the end of this mission. There were a lot of things playing into this, but a big part was the fact that the characters had this light tone that made a serious situation seem far less serious. Okay, so what did we do to fix this? Well, we made it more serious, not like super grimdark serious, Spider-Man type serious. We revised Miles and Pete's conversations throughout the mission and gradually drew out more concern from both of them. Miles started the mission a little bit more uncertain, and Pete started to take the situation seriously way earlier.
We gotta bring him down fast! Yeah, what do we do?
Let us raise temperature.
Oh, bad, very bad!
Okay, so this is a really subtle change, right? But it really helped. Throughout development, Shane and I always told ourselves, we want players to worry that Pete's going to die at the end of this mission. And it was little tone adjustments like this that are what helped sell that misdirect. And these changes really paid off in user testing. Players were genuinely worried that we were going to kill Peter Parker in the first mission of our new game. Okay, so this leads really nicely to probably the biggest challenge of this entire mission, the ending gameplay sequence.
Right. So our initial idea for wrapping up this mission fell pretty flat. You know how when we described the mission, we said that it was going to end with Miles using his new Venom abilities to defeat Rhino? Yeah, initially, all that was going to happen just in a cinematic. There was no boss fight. You would get to use your new Venom abilities on some low-level bots in gameplay. But yeah, it wasn't the big, awesome boss that Rhino was going to be. And again, this choice was intentional. We knew that we had, later on in Act 2, a boss fight against Rhino in full power, so we didn't really want to step on that here in the opening of the game. So this here is the end of Winter Break until pretty late in development. Rhino would charge up his Venom Blast, KO Rhino with one hit, and then we'd have a few more bots infill, say some nasty quip to get Miles to attack him, and then we would release the gameplay, and Miles would use his new Venom abilities on these low-level bots in gameplay, right? Not really super epic or satisfying. After the big intensity of the chase and Rhino Rodeo, defeating Rhino in a cinematic instead of gameplay really felt like a letdown. But I gotta be 100% honest, it took a long time for us to come to terms with this. And funnily enough, the reason why we added this boss fight, it was a bug that turned into a feature. So picture this. One of our animators, the aforementioned James Ham, swings by my desk, taps me on the shoulder. He's like, yo, man, you got to come check this out. And he plays the cinematic where Miles knocks out Rhino in cinematic, all perfectly normal. But at the end of the cine, instead of Rhino staying dead on the ground, he rises from the grave and begins to walk around in gameplay and fight us. And it's the kind of bug that shows up all the time in development. Someone forgot to mark a tick box to make sure that Rhino deletes on cinematic end. So I sort of brush it off to James, yeah, man, I saw that too. It's a bug. But he looks back smirking at me and asks yeah, is it though? And then the gears just started to turn in my head. And then the rest is really history. So here's the version we shipped with.
What was that?
Well, let's be honest here. Adding a boss fight is not as simple as ticking or unticking a box. We had a lot of work to do, from creating phases to integrating Rodeo into the fight, and then the add of that additional room in the final boss sequence here. But by far the most important moment in development was James smiling and asking whether or not Zombie Rhino was really a bug or an opportunity. So this moment opened up our thinking, and as soon as we committed to adding this boss fight, the whole mission really just came together. And by letting players fight Rhino on the stick, they felt like they had saved their mentor, Peter Parker. The player and Miles were now one, they had become Spider-Man, and they were now ready to protect New York. And suddenly, the baton had been passed.
Okay, so what did we learn from all of this? So this might sound super obvious, but you got to iterate. No matter how talented your team, how ambitious your project, you're always going to explore blind alleys and directions that don't work before you get it right. The biggest difference that we've seen between good teams and great teams is that good teams think that if they get it wrong, they've failed. Great teams know that every time they fail, they're one step closer to succeeding.
And collaboration. Game development, as we know, is a team sport, and the unsung secret weapon of collaboration is how it exposes your blind spots. Ben here assumed that we needed all that exposition.
And Shane assumed that the mall was cool enough to sustain interest across the entire mission.
And we both assumed that we didn't need a boss fight.
Our collaborators, sometimes each other, sometimes other members of the team, challenged those assumptions, opened up our thinking, and moved this mission from good to great.
But the most important thing that we learned, focus.
This mission needed to do one thing and one thing only: pass the baton from Peter Parker to Miles Morales. That's it. Anything we did that got in the way of that simple razor had to go. Jokes are too jokey, cut them.
Chase is too long, trim the fat.
Players aren't loving Miles, drop everything and make them love him.
And above all, if players feel like they don't really get to earn the title of New York's only Spider-Man, well, it's time to build that boss fight.
Openers are big. They're insanely challenging to make. And you're going to feel pressure to include every idea you've ever had. But if you stay focused on the essential aspects of your project, stay focused on your razor, eventually with iteration and collaboration, you're going to get there.
And if nothing else, the next time a coworker shows you a hilarious but obviously needs fixing bug, well, maybe take a moment to reconsider.
Okay, cool guys. This is our talk. This isn't live, but in our hearts it is.
There's also some really great Insomniac talks being given by our fellow Insoms.
So you should check them out. Gavin Goulden and Jason Hickey are going to be talking about art direction. Brianna Lindsay is going to be talking about VFX development.
And our creative director, Brian Horton, is going to be talking about the overall creative journey of Miles. And our core technology director, Mike Fitzgerald, will be giving a technical postmortem on the project.
Okay, guys. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.